It's a pleasure to be here, and you're lucky to be getting the benefit of John Moss, who literally wrote the book on the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. I once did a staff ride or battlefield tramp here many years ago. My son was a Marine aviator, and his squadron was based at Cherry Point, North Carolina. His squadron commander was a history buff, and he found out somehow what I was involved in, and asked me to run a tour of Guilford Courthouse. And certainly I was going to say, yes. I didn't want to torpedo my son's career. Anyway, I conducted the tour for the squadron's flight crew and staff non-commissioned officers. And one of those NCOs called his wife after the tour and said that the tramp had been very interesting, and that he learned a lot. And he added that Dr. Conrad knows a lot of shit about a lot of shit. That NCO wife repeated the story to my daughter-in-law, and it's become an inside joke in the family for many years, though I have to admit I was secretly flattered. Now to the question you were promised that I would discuss. How do I rate Nathanael Greene as a general? I may be just a tad biased, but I think he was the greatest general the United States has ever produced. Given the resources that he had at his disposal, the shortage of personnel that he was saddled with, the quality of his opponents, and now, recent scholarship has shown that the British officer corps was not nearly as bad or as inept as it had been previously portrayed. I think what he accomplished is a remarkable and a true genius. My opinion would be a slam dunk, except for one very inconvenient fact. Nathanael Greene never won a major engagement. Though Congress declared him the victor of the Battle of Eutaw Springs, most historians see that battle as a draw. For this simple fact, biographers of Greene look to laud him and come up with other ways to frame his achievements. So how do these historians characterize Greene? Well, the two most common labels you'll see applied to Nathanael Greene are the fighting Quaker and the strategist of the Revolution. Both are colorful and get your attention, but in my opinion, neither is entirely accurate. Let's discuss the fighting Quaker. I was going to ignore this one because it originated with Ellsworth Thane's biography of Nathanael Greene, The Fighting Quaker, written in 1972. Thane, who was a novelist first and foremost, could be excused for adopting such a catchy title. However, more recently, there have been books published, one by Andrew Waters entitled The Quaker and the Gamecock, that puts NG's Quakerism center stage. And in his award-winning biography of George Washington, Ron Chernow also comments about NG's Quaker upbringing as an important factor in his life. I do not agree. Greene rejected his father's Quakerism at a very early age because he considered it profoundly anti-intellectual and does not seem to have ever looked back. Incidentally, he was not forced out of the East Greenwich Society of Friends for his military activities, as it also has been reported. Anyway, back to Greene and Quakerism. Early in his adulthood, Greene wrote to a friend, "I lament the want of a liberal education. I feel the mist of ignorance to surround me. For my own part, I was educated Quaker and amongst the most superstitious sort." Despite what he wrote here, I do not think Greene was ignorant. In fact, he was highly intelligent and really a self-made intellectual. I remember being impressed when I read the memoirs of a French aide to the Baron von Steuben, Pierre Duponceau, who accompanied Greene and Steuben as they rode south in 1780. He wrote that Greene showed a breadth and depth of knowledge of classic literature that impressed Duponceau greatly. I also remember a letter in which Greene ordered a set of David Hume's books for his personal use. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher who is best known for his, quote, highly influential system of empiricism, philosophical scientism, and metaphysical naturalism. How is that for light summer reading? What does this have to do with NG's genius as a military leader? I think two things. It shows that he had a breadth of interests that informed his military decision-making, and more importantly, that he was a quick study who mastered information and could recall it and use it later. There's a quote from Henry Knox that I think is apropos here. He said that when NG joined the Army, he was, quote, the newest, the most untutored being I had ever met. But within a year, he was equal in military knowledge to any general officer in the Army and very superior to most of them. The other common label for Greene is the strategist of the Revolution, which is how historian Theodore Thayer entitled his 1960 biography of Greene. That biography is still considered the best about Greene, but I would contend that Thayer's title is something of a misnomer. It implies that Greene came up with a grand plan for conducting the war that made best use of the resources and terrain, and that he executed that plan and defeated the British. When today's lay people think of strategy in that sense, they think of overall war plans executed by large armies, such as blitzkrieg or island hopping or shock and awe if you talk about Iraq. Greene's genius as a general was not to devise one grand plan and execute it, but instead to adapt, to improvise, and to tailor his operations to make the best use of his assets when his initial plan went awry. His military ability to adjust operations on the fly showed an uncanny understanding of the situation and how best to make the most of it. Greene understood that his forces could do what his forces could do and put them in position to realize those goals, while the British repeatedly tried to do too much and failed. All this despite Britain's overwhelming superiority in trained regulars and supplies. Now, what I'm going to try and do is use the first weeks of Greene's command in the South, the Cowpens, the race to the Dan, as a case study to explore Greene's strengths as a general. And it will hopefully provide some context for tomorrow's tramp. Greene came down in December 1780, and one of the first things he did was decide to split his army. This is considered one of the great strategic decisions that he made, and a controversial one. You don't, if you're an inferior force, you don't split your forces in the face of a superior enemy. Why did Greene do this? Well, I think he saw that the army that Gates had brought up to, Gates was his immediate successor, Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, who failed miserably in the South. But Gates had brought his army to near Charlotte, and it was slowly starving, and desertions were rife. So Greene, who always appreciated the need for a strong, regular army in the South, it was the bulwark, he said, that upon everything else was based. State leaders, particularly in North Carolina, wanted him to rely almost exclusively on militia, but Greene was never willing to do that. He saw the regular army as key. So he decided to split his force, move the regular army, or the bulk of it, down to the Shiraz in South Carolina, and essentially reconstitute it. At the same time, he recognized, and this is another strength that Greene had, he recognized that it's important public opinion and morale among your supporters. So the fact that he was moving further away from Cornwallis made it like a possible retreat. So to keep a presence in western South Carolina and western North Carolina, he left a small force under Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan is the man that ends up fighting at Cowpens. But Greene did not anticipate that fight and would have never accepted the fact that Morgan would try to do it. Or actually, he got chased down by Tarleton. He didn't plan this battle in advance. But Greene set up Morgan's force so that it was small and mobile and did not have any kind of supply wagon train that would slow it down. So this force was to operate in a safe manner. According to Greene, it was to straighten British operations. In other words, make sure that they couldn't send out very small patrols to harass the Patriots. It was to keep up the spirits of the local people. And that was the anticipation, that it was going to be a safe operation and that Morgan would operate as a partisan. So Morgan gets caught at the Pacolet River and he fights the battle of Cowpens, and we'll talk a little bit more about. While Greene's at the Shiraz, there arrived in camp Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion. And this tells you something else about Nathanael Greene. He put emphasis on cavalry and mobility for the Americans. He may not have a superior army, but he wanted an army that was mobile. And he wrote to Washington and said, you know, in the North, cavalry is not important. But in the South, they are vital because with a cavalry, you can prevent a defeat from turning into a rout. So he brought Henry Lee from the Northern Army, and they joined Nathanael Greene's, and probably Light Horse Harry Lee, as he was called, his unit became the key one in Greene's army. As soon as he arrived, and this is kind of interesting about Greene, Greene had just gotten done, literally, writing a letter to Thomas Sumter talking about how War of the Posts, in other words, when you pick off communication and supply small posts, he said, you know, we're fighting for states, not for posts. It's not important. Let's put our emphasis on a big army and a strong army. And then Henry Lee rides into town or down to the Shiraz, and what's he do? He sends him out to work with Marion against a British post at Georgetown. Adaptation. And here's another talent that Greene had. He knew how, or he could anticipate who worked well with whom. The combination of Lee and Marion would be one of the, killer combinations, you will, in the South. They probably did more to win the war than just about anybody else. At the same time, oh, by the way, they didn't capture Georgetown, but they certainly scared the British. Also, Greene at this time is writing letters to the political leaders of the South. And Greene was also an understanding that he had learned from Washington that it was important to be in contact to apprise the political leaders of where you stood, to get their help, to get them on your side. And this is in stark contrast to his predecessors in the South. Robert Howe seemed to always be fighting with everybody. Benjamin Lincoln got used by everybody. And Horatio Gates just ignored everybody. So this was an important change, and it was one that stood Greene in great stead. Now, as I said, at the Battle of Cowpens, Greene did not plan for Morgan to fight. But As soon as he heard about the battle, he left the Shiraz, rode with a small escort, a sergeant's command, across the states of North Carolina and South Carolina and joined Morgan. That was something else. Greene was an activist. And interestingly enough, after he talked to Morgan, he adopted his tactics. The defense in depth idea, and you'll learn a lot about that tomorrow. And it wasn't, it wasn't a slam dunk. Everybody says, oh, defense in depth, sure, that's a great idea. When Washington made his tour of the South in 1791, they tramped this battlefield. And Washington said, whoa, he did what? That was not a good idea. I would have put my best troops in the front. I would have met the British with my best troops, not my worst. So yeah, what Greene did was somewhat controversial. I think it was genius, but it was controversial. When Greene got to Morgan had immediately after the battle had started to retire because he assumed that Cornwallis would come after him, which was true. And he had started to move. Well, Greene caught up with him, and they planned, or Greene tried to create, and this is another one of his decisions. People talk about the retreat to the Dan, and genius, linear battlefield, change, reproducing Mao Zedong's, Great March, that kind of thing. But Greene never wanted to retreat all the way to the Dan River. That was never his original intent. He hoped to stop the British at the Catawba River. Then he hoped to stop them at Guilford Courthouse the first time. This is where the group from the Shiraz caught up with Morgan's detachment. And they unified here, and Greene thought, this is the place we're going to fight the Cornwallis. But he just didn't get enough of a militia turnout. So that's when they decided that they would continue their retreat all the way into Virginia. It was genius because what he was doing is pulling Cornwallis away from his base of supplies and his strength toward the Americans' base of supplies, i.e. Virginia, and the most populous and in terms of numbers of patriots, the most populated state in the South. So at that point in time, Greene decided that he would use the retreat. And again, he made a key and strategic decision that worked well. I want to point out one thing. In the course of this retreat, Greene showed another element of his genius. He was well aware of the terrain. He understood and knew the terrain. For instance, it rained, and Greene pushed Morgan to get across the river because he said, in 2 days, it's going to rise and be unfordable. It was. We call it the miracle of the rivers because every time Cornwallis got there, he had to stop because he ran into raging waters and had to wait for them to subside. There's a famous quote. Nathanael Greene, William Lee Davidson, who was a militia leader in western North Carolina, Davidson County, Davidson College, etc. He said that he talked with Nathanael Greene. He told this to Joseph Graham. Davidson got killed at the Battle of Cowan's Ford. But he told Joseph Graham that he had talked with Nathanael Greene about the Catawba River. And he said, Greene, who had never seen it, knew more about it than men who were born and were raised and lived their whole lives on that river. Another element of that, when Cornwallis destroys his baggage and really starts to push, he's going to overtake Greene, he's going to destroy Greene. He decides that Greene's going to have to go to the upper fords of the Dan River, because they can't cross down below. And Greene reinforced that idea, and this is another element of his genius. He created a small detachment commanded by Otho Holland Williams, including Light Horse Harry Lee, and they veered up toward the upper fords of the Dan River. In the meantime, Greene and the rest of the Army, slow moving, with a huge supply train, headed for Danville, as it is today, or Boyd's Ferry. Cornwallis took the bait. He angled his march toward the west. And only later did he learn where Greene was. He turned, he chased, but that gave Greene and his army enough time to get there. I think it's remarkable that Greene didn't have any desertion, and he was able to save his entire supply train. And this is one of those, you know, they always talk about in the American Revolution, bloody footprints on the snow. Well, you had bloody footprints in the snow as the Southern Army made its way over into Virginia. Greene's understanding, Greene's use of deception, and Greene's willingness to pair subordinates with the best job. His second in command was Benjamin Huger, but he knew he couldn't do what Williams could, so he gave the job to Williams. Once Greene gets across the river, most generals would have sat there. They would have reformed, waited for reinforcements, and then come back at Cornwallis. Greene didn't. Again, he understood it's important to keep the loyalty of the population. It's important to be a presence. So almost immediately after the American Army crossed the Dan River, Greene sent them back, or sent a detachment back, in this case, Light Horse Harry Lee, 2 companies of Maryland Continentals, and they were met by a group of militiamen under Andrew Pickens. So that is another element of Greene's. And finally, the last great strategic decision is post-Guilford Courthouse, and I'll talk about it now. While Greene is chasing Cornwallis, Cornwallis, after the battle, retreats toward the coast, because that's where the British could always find succor. The British Navy was superior until the Battle of the Capes in Virginia in 1781. But Greene goes after him. But then at Ramsey's Mill, he says, this isn't going to work. So he decides to move back into South Carolina. He leaves a British force in his rear, essentially unchallenged, and goes back into South Carolina. I think he anticipated that Cornwallis would follow him, but Cornwallis didn't. And then Greene went after the main British Army or outpost in South Carolina at Camden, loses the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, but initiates a War of the Posts. And the combination of Lee and Marion or Sumter, they essentially pick off all the supply and communication posts that the British have along the Santee River. As a result, Lord Rawdon, the commander at Camden, he can't hold on to that post. He can't get any supplies. He can't get any reinforcements. And he's in a situation where he's just simply going to get besieged again. So he gives it up. Greene developed a plan for how he was going to fight the war in South Carolina. And then when it didn't work, he changed it. It was genius. And the British were forced to move out of the hinterlands. And by the end of the year, they're in enclaves in the coast, down around Charleston. I think that's pretty impressive for what he had and what he did. So, that's what happens when you talk off the top of your head. You forget where you are. So, in summary, Greene was able to adapt on the fly and come up with good or better alternatives than what the first plan had been, and when it did not work out. He was willing to make bold moves, but he wasn't reckless. He was willing to adopt the good ideas of others, i.e. Daniel Morgan's battle tactics. He knew his officers. He played to their strengths. He stressed mobility and the necessity of a good cavalry. He was deft in handling partisan leaders and politicians. He had a terrific knowledge of the terrain. He was a master of details, and he understood the primacy of the regular army. There's a good quote I always like that Nathanael Greene wrote. He wrote to somebody, I had a letter sometime since from Mr. John Trumbull, wherein he asserts that with all my talents for war, I am deficient in the great art of making a timely retreat. I hope I have convinced the world to the contrary, for there are few generals that has run oftener or more lustily than I have done. But I have taken care not to run too far, and commonly have run as fast forward as backward, to convince our enemy that we are like a crab that can run either way. Now, as I promised, I'm going to talk about two key pre-Guilford Courthouse battle engagements that I believe mightily affected the outcome of the battle itself. The first of these is the Battle of Haw River, better known as Pyle's Massacre. First, some background. After crossing the Dan River into Virginia, Greene rested his main army, but in a daring move probably most generals would not make, he sent Lee's Legion, reinforced by Maryland Continentals, back into North Carolina. Lee united with a force of 700 militia commanded by Andrew Pickens, who were already in the state. Lee's mission was to keep pressure on Cornwallis, who was foraging for food in the area south of the Dan River. But more important, Lee was to, and I'm quoting here, rouse the drooping spirits of the North Carolina patriots and to, quote, check the audacity, end quote, of the Loyalists. In particular, Lee was to try to inhibit the recruitment of North Carolina Loyalists by the British and to try and prevent the reestablishment of royal government in this state. And Greene's fears were legitimate. When Cornwallis fell back to Hillsborough, the capital of North Carolina, he issued a proclamation boasting that he had forced the rebels to abandon the state and inviting all subjects to join him and assist in the restoration of order and constitutional government. That is a quote. One Loyalist officer had anticipated the proclamation and had already begun recruiting. By 23 February, Dr. John Pyle, who lived in the area between the Haw and Deep Rivers in north-central North Carolina, recruited men and wrote to Cornwallis informing the general of his success. Cornwallis replied that he would promised to send a detachment of British troops to protect the assembled Loyalists. Estimates of the number of men raised by Pyle range from a low of 200 to a high of about 400, although most modern historians use the higher number. The actual engagement reads like a comic farce had not the outcome been so brutal and bloody. Lee and Pickens had received intelligence that a detachment commanded by Banastre Tarleton was a short distance away from them. The American commanders, in the words of Andrew Pickens, believed this was a glorious opportunity of cutting off a British detachment, and they were hurrying toward the reported position of Tarleton's men. The local Loyalists, of which there were many, could not conceive that an American party would be in this area and imagined the detachment to be a fresh party of the British, especially as both Lee's and Tarleton's command were uniformed in short green coats, which, though not identical, were similar enough to confuse even some of Pickens' men. To further the deception, Lee had his men stick red plumes or feathers in their caps, similar to what Loyalists wore. As the combined command rode to find Tarleton, the vanguard, composed of a Legion officer and several dragoons, encountered two officers from Pyle's command. These Loyalist officers were sent to meet Lee, who decided to pretend that he commanded a detachment from Tarleton's Legion. Lee successfully fooled the Loyalists and sent one of those to rejoin Pyle with a request that Pyle and his command move to the side of the road so Lee's detachment could conveniently pass, as they were much fatigued and needed to get to their night position. The ruse worked so well that Lee and the head of his column were able to pass the entire length of Pyle's command. According to Lee, he had begun to speak with Pyle when firing broke out at the rear because, according to him, some of Pyle's men discovered Pickens' militiamen and opened fire. In his report to Greene, Pickens wrote that the Americans began the fighting. In a third account, written by Captain Joseph Graham, who commanded 70 mounted North Carolinian militiamen who were riding with the Legion cavalry, Graham noticed that Pyle's men had red cloths in their hats, and turned to Captain Joseph Eggleston of the Legion, who was riding beside him. Graham said, "That is a company of Tories. What is the reason they have their arms?" Whereupon Eggleston turned to one of Pyle's officers and asked, "To whom do you belong?" When the Loyalist replied he was a friend of His Majesty, Eggleston struck him over the head with his sword, whereupon Graham's command rushed on the Tories like lightning and cut away. While the engagement may have begun by chance, though other accounts indicate that the attack was premeditated, there is no question that the assault on the Tories was brutal, efficient, and devastating. Indeed, Pyle's men, still convinced that Lee's troops were British, made no preparations to resist. In fact, some of the stunned Loyalists were cut down crying, "God save the king, and you're killing your own men." In less than 10 minutes, according to Pickens, close to 100 Loyalists were killed, and most of the survivors were wounded. Joseph Graham wrote that when he left the field, it appeared that as many as 300 might be lying dead. The British denounced the attack as an atrocity. For example, Cornwallis charged that Pyle's men were most inhumanely butchered when begging for quarter without making the least resistance, while Lee seems to have become, in the words of historian John Buchanan, sensitive to such accusations and tried later to justify his actions. Pickens and Greene were seemingly totally untroubled. The only regret Pickens expressed was that the engagement blasted, I'm quoting here, his hopes of overtaking Tarleton. He added that, quote, "This affair has been of infinite service. It has knocked up Toryism altogether." Surprisingly, too, Greene was unbothered. While he often decried unnecessary violence and its destabilizing effects in the South, he did not do so in this case. Instead, as he wrote to Governor Thomas Jefferson, the dreadful carnage visited on Pyle's detachment, quote, "has had a very happy effect on those disaffected people." Moreover, to Pickens, Greene wrote that the defeat of the Tories was so happily timed and in all probability will be productive of such happy consequences that I cannot help but congratulate you on your success. So why do I emphasize this minor engagement? I believe Greene's paramount goal, after making sure that his army survived, was to prevent the British from reestablishing royal government in North Carolina, and more importantly, ensure that the British did not create a strong Loyalist military force in the state. Pyle's massacre accomplished both of those goals. With the destruction of Pyle's detachment, the possible backbone of a Loyalist military resurgence was gone, and the ruthlessness of the American actions demonstrated convincingly to sympathizers of the king that any move to reestablish royal government would be met with mercilessness and brutality. Therefore, Going into the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene did not have to worry about resurgent loyalism in North Carolina. His goal became to defeat and destroy Cornwallis's army. And John will help you learn how that went. Now, for the second pre-battle engagement that I believe had a major impact on how the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought. In this case, it's the fight at Wetzel's Mills, and I suspect very few people have heard of that one. Some background about that engagement. Greene sent a sizable detachment commanded by Colonel Otho Williams, we've met him before, who was a Continental officer from Maryland, to forage near Wetzel's Mill, which is located near Reedy Fork, while Greene and the rest of the army remained north of the Haw River, because Greene was still awaiting militia reinforcements and was not yet ready to challenge Cornwallis's army. Williams, while foraging, did not realize that Cornwallis knew his location and had dispatched a strong force to get between Williams and the Haw River. Luckily for Williams, one of his patrols spotted the advancing British and alerted the American commander who, guessing their intention, ordered his men to retreat north of Reedy Fork Creek. For several hours, the two detachments raced to the Reedy Ford. Williams barely won the race, and as his Continentals began crossing the ford, the British appeared, whereupon Williams ordered the militia units with him to deploy south of the ford and to protect the Continental units as they continued crossing. The riflemen and militia did as ordered, pouring an effective fire into the advancing British, who were forced to halt their pursuit, form into battle formation, and then advance. The American irregulars then retired some 3 or 4 miles, pursued and fired at by the British. The Continentals did provide the militia with some covering fire, but it wasn't very effective, and the irregulars felt that they had to, quote, cross the Reedy Ford under the whole fire of the enemy. As a result, according to Joseph Graham, the militia and the riflemen were, quote, much dissatisfied with the place that had been assigned them by the Continental officers, not allowing them, as they stated, an equal chance with the regulars, having had to cross Reedy Ford under the whole fire of the enemy. Interestingly, Graham both acknowledges that Wilson was prepared to sacrifice the militia and is sympathetic to Williams' decision. He wrote, "It might be stated in defense of the officers that they were really so situated that it became necessary to risk the sacrifice of one part of the command to save the rest. And though the life of one man is as dear to him as that of another, yet the loss to the cause of 3 or 4 militiamen whose term of service would expire in a week or 2 is not as great a loss as one regular who is well trained and engaged to serve during the war." But this was the kind of logic they were unwilling to accept. Upon returning to camp, there was a mini revolt by the militiamen, and all Greene could do was let them depart, or in the case of the men commanded by South Carolina backcountry militia leader Andrew Pickens, detach them to the South Carolina backcountry. So how does this relate to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse? One of the controversies of the battle involves the performance of the North Carolina militia, who made up Greene's first line in the battle and did not, with a few exceptions, acquit themselves well, leaving what Greene described as the most advantageous position I ever saw with scarcely firing a gun. I believe the engagement at Wetzel's Mill was a major factor in explaining the performance of the North Carolina militia. They would have spoken with their fellow militiamen who had participated in the Wetzel's Mill battle, and those militiamen, I'm sure, were of the opinion that Continental officers were quite willing to fight to the last irregular, And the fact that the North Carolinians were some 800 yards in front of the third line where the Continentals were stationed and could not count on help from the regulars probably reinforced the view that they were sacrificial lambs. I believe this mindset explains why the militia put up such weak resistance. Incidentally, the arrangement of forces at Guilford Courthouse demonstrates another aspect of Greene's genius, as I've talked about before, the tactics that were adopted. Back to Wetzel's Mill. Strengthening my argument about the feeling of vulnerability of the North Carolina militiamen, I believe, is the performance of a few North Carolina militia units on the flanks of the first line, who reportedly fought well and inflicted significant casualties on the advancing British. In fact, one British officer noted that his unit received a galling and destructive fire from these militiamen. Why did these troops fight well? I believe it's because they were protected on their flanks by Continentals. On the right, by William Washington's Dragoons and the Delaware Continental Company, and on the left by a company of Virginia Continentals and Lee's Legion. These troops believed themselves, I feel, to be protected by Continentals and not left to fend for themselves. And as a result, they fought well. That's my view on why two pre-battle engagements were key to the Guilford Courthouse fight and how it progressed. And my views on why Nathaniel Greene is the greatest general ever. Other than that,